Chapter 1. Dust and Rank. The first thing Rena Marrow noticed about Karos 9 wasn't the twin suns, or the way the sky looked bruised at the edges like someone had punched the atmosphere until it learned discipline. It wasn't even the desert itself, an ocean of red grit, so fine it behaved like smoke when the wind grew bored, crawling into seals and seams and lungs with patient, malicious intimacy. The first thing she noticed was the silence that didn't belong to nature, a silence that sat wrong in the bones, too neat, too obedient, as if the planet had been trained to hold its breath, because the Dominion preferred quiet worlds and compliant horizons. The outpost rose from the sand like a metal scab-domed roofs, angular towers, floodlights combing the dunes in slow arcs that were less searchlights than reminders, less about finding threats than about teaching the landscape that it was always being watched, and every surface hummed faintly with powered restraint, every corridor smelling of coolant, ozone, and sterilized authority. Rena's wrists were bound in shock cuffs that pretended to be polite until you tested them, and the collar at her throat was worse, not heavy, not obviously cruel, but intimate in the way it hugged the pulse point beneath her jaw, black smart alloy with a clean seam and an embedded node that could read her skin, measure her stress, and decide how much pain she deserved. They didn't call it a collar, of course. They said compliance ring and behavioral limiter with the clinical smugness of a culture that believed cruelty became civilized if you dressed it in paperwork. But Rena knew the truth with the same certainty she knew gravity. It was a leash. And like every leash ever made, it depended on one thing: who held the other end. She had been here 12 days, and 12 days was long enough for routine to become scripture and for scripture to reveal its loopholes. The Dominion ran on hierarchy the way old engines ran on fuel. Rank tags, command signatures, permission lattices woven so deeply into their systems that obedience wasn't just social, it was electrical, baked into doors and cameras and weapons, and even the way lights dimmed at scheduled hours. Rena learned the outpost's rhythm the way a pilot learned the hum of a ship. Every shift change, every patrol cadence, the exact moment the corridor lights softened at 3:20 station time, when the cooling vents groaned louder and small sounds hid under bigger ones. The guards who talked too much and the guards who touched the control rune on their gauntlets like a prayer every time they passed her cell. She learned their jokes too soft-world, thin bones, primitive lungs, and she learned not to flinch, because flinching was a gift and the Dominion fed on gifts. Fear made them taller. Tears made them righteous. Pain made them confident. So she gave them emptiness, steady breathing, flat eyes, a face that didn't ask to be treated gently. Alone in her bright white cell, she listened to the collar the way she'd once listened to damaged consoles and vacuumed carefully, respectfully, as if the thing might explode if insulted, and she discovered what the Dominion had forgotten because it was too used to winning. The collar wasn't magic, it was frequency. It was an outdated node pulsing in a pattern that synced to a transmitter beyond her cell, recognizing authority not by identity, but by the strongest, highest-ranked signature in range. It didn't understand intention, it understood orders. And orders, she realized, were just signals wearing uniforms. By day 5 she had a plan, not heroic and not clean, but sharp enough to cut, built from patience, observation, and the assumption that the enemy would eventually do something arrogant. Arrogance always arrived. It came on polished boots with a title, because the Dominion did not send true predators to interrogate prisoners. It sent men who believed the universe owed them compliance. Commander Vectorin entered the holding corridor like he owned the air itself, the kind of authority that made taller soldiers step aside without thinking, and the guards snapped so hard their armor plates clicked. His helmet was off, revealing dull bronze skin and cheekbones cut like blades, eyes with a faint metallic sheen like coins submerged in oil, and he looked at Rena the way a person looked at a malfunctioning tool, not hatred, not disgust, but cold irritation at something simple refusing to behave. He spoke in clipped standard, inventorying her like a line item. Human female, crash survivor, suspected intelligence value, uncooperative, costly. Rena met him with slow eye contact and an even slower reply, because silence used correctly could destabilize men who expected begging, and when she said, "I have a name," his expression tightened as if the idea itself was an insult. "Names are for citizens," he replied. "You are an unauthorized presence. You are Dash." He glanced at a datapad. Dash, a survivable anomaly. And the words were meant to shrink her into a category, the way the Dominion shrank worlds into provinces and people into resources. He moved closer, studying the collar, then her wrists, then her face as if truth could be read in bone structure. And when he spoke again, it wasn't a question so much as a demand, wearing the thin mask of procedure. Why was she near the exclusion belt? Why did her vessel carry encrypted traffic? Why had she resisted capture and damaged 2 rifles and required sedation? Rena could have lied. She could have begged. She could have played the submissive prisoner until the right moment. Instead, she chose the most dangerous truth because it was the sharpest bait. Because you kidnapped me. A guard outside the corridor made a choking sound, half laugh and half outrage, but Vec didn't move. He simply let the cold in his eyes deepen until the corridor felt narrower. He talked about patience and time and blood, about the Dominion's right to define events, and his voice never rose because his rank did not require volume. Rena tilted her chin just enough to put the collar in his line of sight and asked softly if that was his patience, a ring on her throat, and she watched the small way his jaw tightened, watched him dismiss the guards with a gesture that said, "I don't need witnesses," even though the camera in the corner remained, because the Dominion always needed a record of its own power. He leaned closer, voice lowering like a blade sliding from its sheath, telling her the collar could teach obedience in ways her nervous system could not ignore. And Rena felt the node respond to the pulse of his gauntlet tightening, tasting her fear, waiting for command, so she swallowed, let the metal bite, and whispered the word she knew would prick his pride. Try. The corridor sharpened, that strange moment before violence when even machines seemed to pause and listen, and Vec's arrogance rose like a tide because she had invited him to take what he already believed he owned. He lifted his hand, and for a fraction of a second Rena wondered if he would simply activate the rune and punish her from a distance like a sensible tyrant. But sensibility was not the Dominion's weakness. Pride was. He reached through the barrier as the doors cycled open, stepped into her cell, and grabbed her collar with his bare fingers like a man seizing a handle. The yank was brutal enough to steal her breath, dragging her upward until her toes barely brushed the floor, pain sparking along the sensitive skin beneath the ring as the chain snapped taut. In the reflection of his visor, she saw herself for an instant, small, collared, apparently helpless, and she let him see what he wanted to see: tightened throat, widened eyes, the performance of fear, because the more he believed her weak, the closer he would bring his signal to the node. He leaned in, murmuring about regret being for the conquered, about her already being conquered, and the words were meant to crush her spirit the way the collar crushed her pulse. But Rena's mind had gone clear and cold, because this was exactly the arrogance she'd been waiting for. Under her tongue, hidden where no casual scan would search unless it already knew to look, was a thin shard of flexible polymer bitter as medicine, printed with a circuit she had assembled from stolen scraps, a resonator harvested from a broken datapad, a contact strip from maintenance waste, microcapacitors disguised as chewing debris. She bit down, and the shard snapped, releasing a tiny controlled surge through saliva into the collar's inner contact points, not enough to fry the node, not enough to trigger tamper failsafes, just enough to introduce interference, just long enough to make outdated Dominion tech do what it always did under confusion: search for the highest authority signature in range. And the highest signature in that small sealed cell was not the cheap transmitter. It was Vec's gauntlet, pressed right against the collar like a crown being forced onto the wrong head. The node chirped softly, almost polite, and a tiny status light flickered on the underside of the ring. Once, twice, then steadied. And Vec didn't notice because he was enjoying the leverage, enjoying the way her breathing hitched, enjoying the ancient comfort of being the one who pulled the chain. He pressed his thumb to the command rune out of habit, expecting pain to ripple through her nerves and make her fold. The rune pulsed. The collar remained silent, and something in the air changed so subtle that only someone trained to read systems would catch it, like a ship's engines altering pitch. Rena's feet settled fully on the floor as the chain slackened a fraction, and she looked up at him with a smile that wasn't wide or dramatic but precise, the kind of smile that said she had already stepped somewhere he could not follow. "You grabbed the wrong thing," she whispered, and when Vec's brow furrowed and his grip tightened, the collar didn't tighten with him. It loosened, obeying a new authority. He released it as if it had burned him, thumb jabbing the rune again, harder, insulted, and nothing happened. No shock, no paralysis, no obedience, just the quiet refusal of a system that had reassigned its master. The guards beyond the glass shifted uneasily, sensing the tremor without understanding it, because Dominion soldiers could smell weakness the way predators smell blood, but they had never seen it in a commander's hands. Vec's gaze snapped from gauntlet to collar to her face, anger sharpening into realization, and Rena lifted her bound hands just enough for the cuffs to clink and said softly, It doesn't listen to you anymore. It listens to whoever it thinks outranks you. The camera in the corner adjusted, zooming slightly as if the outpost itself had become curious, and for the first time since the Dominion had dragged her from wreckage and ringed her throat in black metal, Rena felt something she hadn't felt in 12 days. Options. Not freedom yet, not safety, but the leverage that made freedom possible. Vectorin stood rigid, pride battling calculation, because humiliation was a crack that could collapse careers, and Rena understood with a calm that frightened even her. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was the start of the part that mattered, because men like Vec could survive defeat in battle, but they could not survive the idea of losing control in front of witnesses, and that kind of threatened ego made commanders do desperate things. She tasted the lingering bitterness of the snapped circuit under her tongue, felt the collar hum with its new allegiance, and knew that whatever happened next, whatever he tried, whatever he ordered, whatever he broke, Kairos 9 was no longer quiet, and something in this outpost was about to burn. Chapter 2. The Click of Ownership. Vectorin did not panic the way lesser officers panicked. He didn't stumble, didn't shout, didn't flinch away from Rena, as if she had suddenly grown claws. His panic was colder, more disciplined, the kind that stayed locked behind the eyes while the body remained sharp and capable, because Dominion command training didn't erase fear so much as it taught you to store it in a sealed compartment and weaponize it later. He stared at his gauntlet rune as if he could intimidate a system into obedience, thumb pressing the command glyph once, twice, then a third time with deliberate pressure that implied the universe itself had made an administrative error. The collar's node answered with a soft, almost courteous chirp, and nothing else happened. No twitch, no scream, no collapse, only Rena standing there with her breath returned, and that small, controlled smile that felt like a blade's edge. Outside the glass, the corridor guards shifted, their posture changing the way animals changed when a storm approached, because they were watching something they had never been trained to process. A commander's authority failing in real time, not in battle where failure could be blamed on chaos, but in a clean corridor under a camera's eye where failure belonged only to the one holding the leash. Vec's gaze snapped from the collar to the tiny status light to Rena's face, and he understood enough to be furious without understanding enough to be calm. His voice dropped to a dangerous quiet as he spoke, the tone commanders used when they wanted the threat to sound inevitable rather than emotional. "You have interfered with Dominion property," he said, and the phrase was almost comical property, as if the collar was the only thing he meant, as if Rena's body and choices were not also included in that sentence by default. Rena didn't answer right away, letting the silence do what it did best, make him hear his own certainty echo back at him until it sounded brittle. When she finally spoke, it wasn't triumphant. It was factual, like a pilot stating altitude. "I didn't interfere with your property," she said softly. "I refiled it. The collar thinks I outshrank you." Vec's nostrils flared, and for a heartbeat the mask slipped enough to show the raw nerve underneath humiliation, not fear, because the Dominion did not teach its officers to fear prisoners, but it did teach them that being seen without control was a kind of death. He took a half-step closer, then stopped, recalculating, and Rena watched the calculation like you watched a predator decide whether to pounce or circle. He wasn't stupid, he wasn't clumsy, and that was what made him dangerous, because a foolish tyrant made mistakes you could predict, but a competent one learned quickly. He tested the collar again, this time not by pressing the rune, but by shifting the gauntlet's broadcast mode, flicking to an override channel that would normally force all compliance devices in range to resynchronize with the highest-ranked signature. The corridor lights flickered with the pulse. A few wall panels responded, as if acknowledging his command, and for a moment he thought he had it until the outpost's internal speaker crackled and the cheap station AI announced, in its flat, cheerful voice, "Override conflict detected. Highest authority signature recognized. Compliance node priority alpha." The words were meaningless to the guards, but Vec heard the real message inside them. The station's obedience had shifted. His jaw tightened so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin, and Rena felt the collar's hum deepen slightly, like a machine settling into a new master's hand. And she realized something else too. Her plan had worked, but it had also escalated the situation into a place where men like Vec did not retreat. They either crushed the threat or found a way to make it look like they had never been threatened at all. That second option was worse. The corridor outside her cell suddenly felt smaller, not because the walls had moved, but because everyone's instincts had, tightening inward toward the possibility of violence. The guards didn't raise their rifles, they didn't dare point weapons while a commander stood directly in front of them, but their fingers drifted toward triggers, their eyes darting between Rena and Vec, as if searching for permission to decide what reality was. Vec lifted his head, and when he spoke again, the softness was gone. Now his voice carried the clipped authority of someone issuing orders into a battlefield, because he had recognized what mattered most in this moment. Not regaining control of the collar immediately, but controlling the narrative of what happened next. Station security, seal the detainee. He snapped toward the wall mic, adding a string of Dominion command syllables that were supposed to be unambiguous. For a second, nothing answered, and that delay itself was an insult. Then the station AI returned, still cheerful, still terrible, unable to comply. Authorization conflict. Vec's gaze flicked to Rena, and the air between them tightened like a wire drawn taut. Rena didn't gloat. She simply tugged the chain once with minimal motion, and the collar responded by loosening a fraction more, making a quiet metallic whisper against her skin that felt indecently intimate, like a lock clicking open. The tug had another effect too. The corridor camera's tracking shifted subtly, centering on her rather than Vec, because the outpost security net recognized the collar's priority tag and assumed that the person wearing it was the authority figure, not the person who had once controlled it. One of the guards outside made a confused sound, half a grunt, because their suit HUDs were now showing conflicting authority indicators. Vec's presence, her collar's priority. Dominion soldiers were trained to obey hierarchy embedded in tech. They weren't trained for situations where hierarchy contradicted itself. Vec saw the confusion and reacted fast, stepping sideways to block the guard's line of sight to the collar's status light, physically inserting himself between evidence and witnesses, because that was a commander's instinct. Control what others saw, control what they believed. He lowered his voice again and leaned toward her, but not close enough to touch the collar this time. He had learned at least that much. "You will restore the collar," he said, each word measured, as if careful pronunciation could make reality comply. "If you do not, I will have you terminated as a hostile infiltrator." Rena's smile thinned, not from fear, but from disgust. "You mean you'll murder me because your toy stopped obeying?" she replied. "Call it whatever you want." Vec's eyes narrowed. "Do not misunderstand the situation," he said. "Your body is in my station. Your blood will spill here if I decide it." Rena held his gaze and let the words settle. She knew he could kill her. A broken collar didn't make her bulletproof. But she also knew something else. He could kill her only if he accepted a certain kind of risk: alarms, reports, questions, audits. A dead human in a cell was a mess. A dead human after a commander's public loss of control was a disaster. Dominion bureaucracy was a weapon in its own right, and it ate officers alive when it sensed weakness. So Rena did what she had learned to do in hard environments. She offered him a route that preserved his ego while still moving her toward her exit. "You want answers," she said, calm and quiet in a way that made the guards lean forward without realizing. "You want a report that you extracted intelligence. Take me to your command room. Alone. You'll get your story, and I'll tell you why my ship was near the exclusion belt." Vec's expression tightened further, because she wasn't just bargaining, she was writing his escape from humiliation, and he hated her for understanding him well enough to do it. "And why would I do what you want?" he asked, but the question was already weakening, because he had realized he needed time, privacy, and distance from witnesses to fix this without losing face. Rena looked past him at the corridor camera, then back at his eyes, and her voice remained soft. "Because if you don't," she said, "I'll walk out anyway. And the station will treat me like a commander on inspection. Your guards will see it. Your logs will show it. And your superiors will ask why your leash slipped." The last sentence landed like a knife under armor, because it wasn't a threat of physical harm, it was a threat of institutional hunger. They moved through the outpost in a procession that felt surreal, like someone had swapped the labels on reality. Vec walked beside her rather than behind, close enough to appear in control and far enough not to touch her collar again, and the guards fell in behind at a distance, unwilling to leave their commander alone with a prisoner, yet terrified of being seen too near if this became an official failure. Rena kept her posture neutral, not strutting, not slouching. She looked like someone escorting a commander rather than being escorted, and she could feel the station's subtle shifts responding to her collar's new tag. Doors unlocking a half-second faster, hallway lights adjusting as she passed, security cameras tracking her with a prim, automatic interest. Soldiers they passed snapped to attention reflexively, then hesitated when their HUDs flashed conflicting icons: Vec's rank glyph, and the collar's priority alpha. And the hesitation was a crack that spread quickly through a disciplined culture. Dominion obedience worked best when no one had to think. Thinking was slow, Thinking was dangerous. Thinking created questions. Rena watched a young soldier's eyes flicker as he processed the conflict, watched him glance at Vec for reassurance, and saw the slightest tremor in his confidence when Vec didn't immediately bark a correction. It was a tiny thing, but empires were made of tiny things. She mapped the outpost as they walked service doors, junction panels, weapon lockers, emergency bulkheads, and every time she saw an access terminal, she felt the collar hum, as if the station itself was offering her its throat to bite. It would have been easy to cause chaos on lock cells, trigger alarms, turn lights off and on, isolate sections of the base. But chaos was noisy, and noise invited response. Rena didn't want revenge. Revenge was heavy. She wanted an exit and, if possible, a future where she wasn't hunted by every Dominion unit between here and the border. So she stayed precise. She gave the station no reason to scream. She gave Vec no reason to be heroic. When they reached the command level, the air changed, less ozone, more filtered sterility, the scent of money and rank. The command room door slid open with a smooth sigh, and Vec stepped inside first, motioning her in with a rigid gesture that felt like swallowing poison. The doors sealed behind them, shutting out the corridor witnesses and the hungry cameras that existed everywhere else. This room had its own security, its own private logs, its own controlled reality. Tactical displays glowed along the walls, desert maps, orbital tracks, patrol schedules, Dominion insignias rendered in crisp light. A large central console hovered like an altar. Vec turned to face her with a posture that said he was still commander here even if the collar disagreed. Hand hovering near his sidearm, but not drawing, because drawing would acknowledge danger, and acknowledging danger would mean acknowledging her. Talk, he said. Now. Rena didn't rush. She let her breathing slow. She felt the collar's hum and understood that if she pushed too hard, the station might interpret her as a mutineer and trigger failsafes she didn't yet know existed. Outdated tech had weird teeth. She chose words like tools, not like weapons. My ship wasn't near the exclusion belt by accident, she began. It was following a signal. Vec's eyes narrowed. What signal? He demanded. Rena stepped closer to the console but didn't touch it, keeping her movements small so they wouldn't trigger security reflexes. A distress beacon, she said. Human-coded. Old. Repeating. Decades old. Vec's expression hardened into skepticism with a familiar edge of contempt. Humans do not travel that far, he said. Your species barely crawls beyond its moon. Rena's lips pressed together, and she felt anger rise, not because the insult was new, but because it was convenient. That's what you've been taught, she replied. And teaching you that keeps you obedient. Vec's eyes flashed. Do not speak to me of obedience, he snarled, and the words came sharper than he intended, because the collar had made the concept painful. Rena watched the flash of emotion and recognized it. He wasn't just angry at her. He was angry at the existence of a situation where he had to think about obedience at all. She went on anyway, because stopping now would invite him to seize control through violence, and she needed him listening. The beacon adapts, she said. It's not random static. It's structured coordinates repeating with interference correction, the kind of pattern you use when you expect someone to jam you. Vec's gaze flicked involuntarily toward the star map on the wall, toward the orbital tracks. A beacon that expects jamming is a military beacon, he said. Humans do not possess such technology. Rena's voice stayed calm, but her eyes sharpened. Then explain why I heard it, she said. Explain why it led me here. Explain why your patrols were on me within hours of my crash, like they were waiting. Vec's jaw tightened, because she had pressed on something that might be true. Dominion patrol patterns were not random. They were guided by intelligence. And intelligence implied interest. You are suggesting the Dominion is chasing a human distress signal, he said slowly. That would imply. He didn't finish, because finishing would give the thought weight. Rena did it for him. It would imply you've known about it, she said. And you don't want humans reaching it first. Vec's eyes narrowed into a thin, dangerous line. And why would the Dominion care if a primitive species finds an old beacon? He asked. Rena inhaled slowly. Because it isn't just a beacon, she said. It's a marker, a breadcrumb, something hidden that your empire doesn't want recovered. She paused, watching him. Something you buried in your archives as a myth. The room's lights flickered once as a power ripple moved through the station, subtle enough that most would ignore it, but both of them felt it. A tiny shiver of systems, a momentary dip in the console glow. Vec's head tilted slightly, listening not with ears but with trained awareness, and his hand drifted closer to his sidearm without quite touching it. We're being scanned, he murmured. Rena's stomach tightened. By who? Vec didn't answer immediately. He moved to the comm panel and issued a crisp order. All units, report. And the response was not words but static, thick, and ugly. The comm crackled, died, then returned with a faint hiss, as if something had sunk claws into the signal and squeezed. The tactical displays blurred for a heartbeat, then rearranged themselves, and Rena felt the collar at her throat change tone, not tightening, not punishing, but resonating, as if it recognized a frequency older than the station's cheap transmitter. A new symbol appeared on the central console. Angular, unfamiliar, not Dominion, not human, like a geometric scar. Vex swore under his breath, the first real crack of composure. Unknown intrusion, he said. This is impossible. The speakers in the ceiling crackled, and a voice filled the room, calm, clear, carrying an accent that didn't belong to any species Rena had heard, yet somehow it sounded like it had been listening for a long time. Commander Vectorin, the voice said, you have made a catastrophic miscalculation. Vec's posture stiffened, weapon half drawn before he controlled himself, and he snapped, identify yourself. The voice paused, almost amused by the demand. I am the custodian of what your Dominion buried, it replied. I am the warden of the signal you chase. And I am the reason your collars exist. Rena's throat went cold. Vec's eyes flashed. Collars are Dominion law, he said, forcing contempt back into his voice like armor. They are tools. They are chains made from fear. The voice answered, and the words were not emotional, they were observational, like a scientist describing a specimen. Your empire encountered humanity once, before your history was rewritten. Your leaders learned that humans do not submit the way other species do. They learned that if you cannot break a human spirit, you must pretend it is inferior. So you built doctrine. You built stories. You built technology to put obedience where you could not put respect. Rena felt the collar hum in agreement, and a sick understanding slid into place. This device wasn't purely Dominion. It was derived, stolen, simplified, repurposed. The screens shifted, filling with an image that made Rena's breath catch. A ship, human-made but not like anything modern, sleek with design language that felt ahead of its time, hallmarked by a symbol she recognized from half-buried files in Earth's deep space archives, a crescent and spear motif that had been dismissed as a myth, a rumor, a ghost story told by older pilots with too much whiskey and not enough sleep. The Artemis, Reno whispered, and the name tasted like fire and longing. Vex stared at the image as if it threatened him personally. Myth, he said, but the words sounded weak. The voice spoke again, softer now, almost patient. It is real, it said. It hid. It waited. It learned. Vex's fists clenched. Why speak to us? He demanded, because anger was easier than awe. Why now? The voice answered with the chill of certainty. Because the Dominion's leash is slipping, it said. Because a human has learned to turn your chain into a key. The collar on Rena's throat warmed slightly, and she felt the station's security net shift again, doors and cameras and systems recalibrating, as if unsure whose orders mattered most. They are coming. The voice continued, and the tactical display flashed new motion tracks outside the outpost fast, disciplined, lethal. Your superiors have dispatched a retrieval unit. Not to save you, Commander, but to erase what you have seen. Vex's face tightened, and something like genuine fear flickered for the first time, not fear of death, but fear of being discarded by the empire he served. Rena heard distant alarms begin to rise, muted by layers of bulkhead and protocol, and she understood the voice wasn't warning them out of kindness. It was moving pieces into place. Go to the signal, the voice said. Bring her. You will escort her. Vex's lips pulled back in a snarl. I will not, dash, you will. The voice interrupted, and this time the comm sharpened into something that made Rena's bones feel small. Because you have a choice. Die as an obedient officer, or live long enough to learn what your empire has been hiding. The command room lights brightened as if an invitation, and coordinates appeared on the star map closer than Rena expected, dangerously close, pulsing in a pattern that felt like a heartbeat. Vex stared at the coordinates, then at Rena, then at the collar, and in that triangulation his worldview cracked. Prisoner and commander, leash in hand, reversed. Rena didn't celebrate the reversal, because she could already feel the cost of it rising in the alarms outside. Instead, she stepped forward, voice low and steady. If that retrieval unit reaches this room, she said, they'll kill you first. Vex's jaw flexed as if he were chewing on poison. And you? He asked. Rena's smile returned, small and hard. They'll put a new collar on me, she said. one they understand better. Vex's eyes narrowed, and for the first time his gaze held something other than contempt calculation that included possibility. If we leave, he said slowly, you understand what that makes me. Rena met his eyes without blinking. It makes you alive, she replied. And it makes you useful. The alarms grew louder, and somewhere beyond the sealed doors, boots began to move with the purposeful rhythm of people sent to clean a mess. And in that moment, the biggest mistake of Vec Torin's life stopped being a single arrogant grab in a prison cell and became something broader and more irreversible. He had touched the chain, and in doing so he had pulled on a truth that was attached to everything. Chapter 3. The Human Beacon. They didn't leave the command room immediately, not because they had time to negotiate morality, but because the Dominion trained Vec Torin to treat every crisis as a puzzle that could be solved with the correct application of command. And his first instinct even now, even with the collar's authority lattice tilted against him, was to reach for systems the way a drowning man reached for air. He moved to the wall console with brisk, controlled steps, fingers dancing across the interface as he tried to pull up internal security feeds, override the comm jamming, and confirm what the disembodied voice had claimed about a retrieval unit. The screens obeyed him for a heartbeat, displaying corridor maps and heat signatures and a partial roster of on-station personnel. And then the intrusion pushed back like a tide returning to claim the shore. Images blurred into static, the Dominion insignia distorted, and a new overlay crawled across the data like frost-angular symbols and lines of code written in a logic that felt older than the station's cheap AI, smarter than Vec's rank tags, and utterly uninterested in his pride. Reno watched him with the calm of someone who had survived enough disasters to recognize when an emergency was no longer about controlling the environment and had become about choosing the least fatal direction. She could hear the alarms outside now as something more than a distant whine, the sound threading through bulkheads and air vents in that unmistakable rising cadence that meant doors were sealing, sections were quarantining, and soldiers were being routed into kill corridors. The voice custodian, warden, whatever it truly was, didn't speak again immediately, as if it had delivered its message and was now allowing them to decide whether they deserved to live. But Rena could still feel its presence like pressure in the air, like gravity subtly shifting. The collar at her throat had warmed into a steady hum that made her skin prickle, and each time Vec's consoles flickered she felt the device respond not with pain or control, but with recognition, as if the collar were a fragment of a larger instrument that had finally heard the rest of its song. Vec's eyes narrowed as he forced a partial feed to stabilize, and what appeared on the largest display was not the corridor outside, but an exterior scan, storm-blown dunes lit by floodlights, the outpost's perimeter fence half buried in red grit, and beyond its shapes moving with disciplined speed through the dust haze, their armor signatures sharp and bright, like predators' eyes. The retrieval unit was not a patrol, it was a surgical team. Their helmets were sealed and smooth, their movements synchronized, their weapons heavier than anything stationed at a backwater outpost meant to see. And there was a drone with them, an insectal black thing skimming just above the sand, its sensors pulsing in wide sweeps, as if it were sniffing for secrets. Vec's jaw set, the muscle jumping beneath his bronze skin, because the sight confirmed the insult that mattered most. High Command had not sent reinforcements to support him. It had sent a blade to remove him cleanly. "They're not here for the prisoner," he said, the words forced through clenched teeth. And hearing him say prisoner with that old certainty again was almost absurd given the collar's new allegiance, yet it revealed something important. Even as his empire prepared to discard him, his mind still tried to hold on a hierarchy as a life raft. Rena didn't correct the word. She didn't waste breath on pride. "They're here to erase the question," she replied softly, watching the retrieval team's heat signatures slip toward the outpost service entrance where the storm provided cover. "If the question exists, the answer threatens someone higher than you." Vec's eyes flicked toward her with a flash of anger that was rapidly turning into something else, fear, sharpened by betrayal. "You think you understand the Dominion," he muttered. "I understand systems," Rena said, voice steady, and she nodded toward the screen. "That's a system solving a problem. You're the problem." Vec's hand hovered near his sidearm again, but this time the gesture wasn't about threatening her. It was about feeling the comfort of a weapon when the world had stopped respecting his title. Outside the sealed command room, boots thundered in distant corridors, and the station AI's cheerful tone cut through the alarm in brief bursts. Section lockdown initiated. Please remain calm. The juxtaposition was grotesque, like a nursery rhyme sung during an execution, and Rena felt the collar hum in irritation as if even the device found the station's compliance programming pathetic. The voice finally returned, not through the speakers alone, but through the collar's resonance. As if it had discovered the most direct path into the room was not the station's hardware, but the ring around Rena's throat. "You have minutes," it said, calm as ever, and the calm was more frightening than urgency because it implied certainty. It implied that it had seen this pattern before and knew exactly how the Dominion cleaned its messes. Vec turned sharply, scanning the room as if searching for a hidden comm unit he could shoot. "Where are you?" he demanded. The voice did not indulge him with a location. "I am in the signal," it replied. "I am in the collar. I am in the way your systems misunderstand authority." Rena exhaled slowly. "You said the Artemis is real," she said, forcing herself to keep the tremor out of her voice because the name had lived in the corners of Earth's archives like a ghost story, the kind of story pilots told when they wanted to believe that humans had once been bolder than politics allowed. "You said it hid. Where?" The room's star map shifted, and the coordinates pulsed again closer than interstellar logic should have permitted, nested like a secret inside a region the Dominion labeled empty. Vex stared at the coordinates with the expression of a man seeing a door appear in a wall he had always believed solid. "That region is quarantined," he said, voice tight. "Nothing exists there." Rena's eyes didn't leave the map. "That's what quarantine is for," she murmured. "To keep people from asking why." The retrieval unit hit the outpost's outer systems like a fist, and the command room lights dimmed as power redistributed to lockdown protocols. On the security feed, an exterior door vanished behind a storm of static as the drone deployed something small and bright, a charge that didn't explode so much as silenced. It pulsed that murdered local sensors, leaving the outpost briefly blind, and therefore obedient to the only thing it could still trust: internal hierarchy. Rena felt the collar surge, briefly asserting itself like a captain grabbing the helm in rough weather, and she realized the device was doing more than passively receiving the voice's instructions. It was actively mediating the station's behavior, translating authority tags, shuffling priorities, rewriting assumptions. It was a key, yes, but it was also a bridge. Vec watched the feeds die one by one and made a decision that looked like surrender, but was actually survival. He moved to the weapons cabinet, keyed it open with his gauntlet, and when the console hesitated confused by the conflicting authority, Rena tugged the collar chain once, not as a threat, but as a quiet command, and the cabinet unlocked with a crisp click that sounded like the outpost choosing a new master. Vec paused, eyes narrowing at her, and she could almost hear the reluctant thought forming in his head. "If I fight her, I die. If I use her, I live." He pulled out a compact rifle with a heavy power cell and slung it across his back, then grabbed a second weapon, a smaller sidearm, and held it out toward her, grip first. "If you intend to betray me," he said, voice low, "do it quickly." Rena took the weapon with bound hands as best she could, not because she planned to shoot him, but because she understood the language of offering. Even Dominion commanders knew that when you handed someone a weapon, you acknowledged them as a participant rather than an object. "I don't have time for betrayal," she replied. "I have time for escape." Beck's mouth tightened. "Escape to where?" he asked. "To the signal," Rena said, and the words felt unreal even as she spoke them, because the idea that the Artemis existed hidden, waiting made the universe feel slightly larger and slightly less hopeless. They left the command room through a maintenance corridor that Vec would never normally use, a narrow passage lined with cables and coolant pipes, because the retrieval unit would approach through official routes and kill corridors, and the only way to outrun a system was to step into the spaces the system didn't bother to glorify. The station was changing around them, sealing doors, rerouting power, triggering emergency bulkheads, and each time a panel tried to deny them access, Rena felt the collar hum, and the denial softened into compliance. Not because the station liked her, but because it recognized the collar's priority tag and assumed that any movement made under that tag must be correct. It was an absurdity so deep it became a kind of poetry. The Dominion had built a culture where hierarchy mattered more than truth, and now that same hierarchy was escorting a human prisoner through locked doors like an honored official. Vec moved with brutal efficiency, checking corners, listening for footsteps, reading the subtle changes in air pressure that indicated doors sealing ahead, and Rena matched his pace despite the cuffs, despite the collar, despite the adrenaline surging in her veins like wildfire. Somewhere above them, a heavy thud reverberated through the structure-breaching charges on internal doors, and Vec muttered a curse in his native tongue. "They're inside," he said. "They'll go to your cell first," Rena replied. "When they don't find me, They'll start hunting for logs, Vex said, voice tight. When they find the logs are corrupted, Rena continued, they'll decide you're compromised. Vex shot her a glance. You speak like you've seen Dominion doctrine before, he said. Rena's lips pressed into a line. I've seen empires before, she answered. They always do the same thing when they're afraid. They blame the nearest officer. The maintenance corridor opened into a wider service bay where ground vehicles were stored, crawler rigs, sand skimmers, a few armored transports designed for desert patrol. The bay lights flickered, then stabilized, and Rena felt the collar's hum deepen again, as if the voice within it were leaning closer. Not the vehicles, it said, calm but firm. The hangar below. Vex head snapped up, eyes scanning the bay. There is no hangar below, he said sharply. This outpost is a dash. He stopped, because the station schematic had always been presented to him as complete, and in that moment he realized he might have been stationed in a place he did not fully understand. Rena looked toward the far wall where a maintenance hatch was half hidden behind stacked crates, marked with faded hazard stripes and an old code in Dominion script that suggested it had been sealed long before Vex's assignment. There's always an unused section, she murmured. That's where secrets go. Vex approached the hatch cautiously, weapon ready, and when he keyed the panel, the outpost hesitated. Authorization conflict again until Rena tugged the chain, and the hatch unlocked with a tired sigh, like a mouth opening after years of silence. Stale air drifted out, carrying the scent of dust and dormant machinery. Vex glanced at her. If you're lying, he said. Rena met his eyes. Then your retrieval unit won't have to kill you, she replied. The station will. They descended a narrow stairwell into darkness broken by emergency strips, each step echoing as if the outpost had hollow bones. The deeper level was colder, the air less filtered, and the walls bore older construction marks, weld seams, patch panels, signs of hurried work. Rena's pulse hammered as she recognized the architecture of neglect. This was a space that had been built for purpose, then abandoned when that purpose became inconvenient. At the bottom, the stairwell opened into a broad chamber with tarps draped over massive shapes, the floor layered in dust thick enough to record every footprint, like a confession. Vex's helmet lights swept across the room, revealing a dormant launch rail, fuel lines capped and sealed, and a central platform where something large slept under a heavy fabric shroud. Rena felt her throat tighten. She didn't need the voice to tell her. She knew this shape. It was the silhouette that had haunted her dreams since the crash, the broken hull of her ship, scavenged by the Dominion and hidden like an embarrassment, as if keeping it out of sight could erase the fact that a human vessel had reached this far. Vex's posture stiffened. This is not on any schematic, he muttered, and the words carried an edge of genuine shock. Rena stepped closer, dust shifting under her boots, and when she pulled the tarp back, the fabric rasped like sandpaper, revealing her ship's scarred hull-burned plating, cracked cockpit glass, engine mounts stripped clean. It looked like a wounded animal. It looked like home. Her chest tightened with something that wasn't nostalgia, but rage. The Dominion had not only captured her, it had disassembled her escape and hidden the remains like a trophy. Vex watched her face and read the emotion there like a tactical map. You can fly this? He asked. Rena's laugh was short and sharp. Not like this, she said, fingers tracing the hull seam where she knew the power coupling should be. They stripped the drives. Vex's eyes flicked around the hangar, assessing. Then we are trapped, he said. Not necessarily. The voice murmured through the collar, and the collar's hum shifted as if aligning with something beyond the outpost. Your ship is not the key. It is the bridge. The beacon will do the rest. Above them, the station shook with another breach. Dust drifted from the hangar's ceiling in slow, lazy spirals, like the outpost shedding skin. Vex swore again and moved toward a control panel embedded in the hangar wall, trying to bring the platform systems online, but the interface was dead, power offline, lines cut. No electricity, he growled. No launch. Rena looked past him at a cluster of conduit pipes running into the wall, and something in her memory clicked. During forced labor shifts, they had used maintenance access here to dump broken parts, and she had seen old capacitors stacked like bricks, forgotten by the guards because they didn't understand human improvisation. She moved to a storage rack, yanked open a dusty drawer, and found what she hoped for: portable power cells, older Dominion issue, heavy and reliable. She couldn't free her hands yet, but she could maneuver enough to drag one cell to the panel, wedge it into the slot, and lock it in with her shoulder. The panel lights flickered to life. Vex stared at her for a heartbeat, the kind of look that said he hated needing her competence. You trained for sabotage, he muttered. I trained for survival, Rena answered. The platform systems began to whir, slow at first, like a sleeping machine waking with stiff joints. Fuel valves clicked open. Hydraulics groaned. The ship's interior lights flickered behind cracked cockpit glass. Rena felt hope surge like a dangerous drug, and she hated hope because hope made you careless, but she couldn't stop it. The ship was alive enough to listen. Connect, the voice said. Let the collar speak to the hull. Rena frowned. The collar is a restraint, she whispered. A restraint derived from a restraint, the voice replied. It was built to bind what the Dominion feared. Before they twisted it into cruelty, it was a control interface for something else. Vec's eyes narrowed. You are saying the collar is older than the Dominion, he said, and the disbelief in his tone was weaker now, exhausted by too many revelations arriving too fast. Older than your Dominion, the voice confirmed. And compatible with the Artemis. Rena's hands trembled as she stepped onto the platform and climbed into her ship's cockpit, shards of glass crunching under her boots. The interior smelled like burnt insulation and dust, but the control layout was familiar enough that her muscles remembered it even as her mind raced. She settled into the pilot's seat, the harness half melted and stiff, and stared at the dead main display. How do I connect? She asked. The collar warmed, and the hum shifted into a pattern that made her teeth ache. Close the circuit, the voice said. Let the collar complete what your ship cannot. Rena swallowed, feeling the metal ring around her throat like a hand that had finally chosen not to choke. She reached to the collar with bound hands, fingers brushing the seam, and the moment her skin contacted the node, the cockpit display flickered first static, then a pale glow, then a clean line of text that made her breath catch because it wasn't Dominion standard, it wasn't Earth standard, it was something else. Older human code, archaic but readable, like a language remembered from childhood. The words appeared, steady and certain, Artemis Link, ready. Vec leaned into the cockpit doorway, eyes wide, and for the first time his expression held something like awe rather than contempt. What is Artemis? He whispered. Rena's throat tightened. A story, she said, voice trembling despite her effort. A flagship. A ghost. The display responded as if hearing her, and the star map bloomed across it, coordinates pulsing like a heartbeat in the black. The hangar around them rumbled as if the outpost itself had noticed and didn't like what was waking in its basement. The retrieval unit found the hangar entrance at the same moment the ship's systems finished booting. Vec heard the distant clang of a sealed door being cut open, metal screaming as a plasma cutter bit through, and his body tensed into combat readiness with reflexive ease. They're coming, he said, and the words were not a warning so much as a statement of inevitability. Rena's display flashed again, and a line of text appeared beneath the coordinates. Jump window, 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Rena stared. Jump, she breathed. Her ship did not have a functioning jump drive. It didn't even have engines. The beacon will do the rest, the voice reminded her. It will open a corridor. Your ship only needs to be aligned. Vec's eyes narrowed. And what happens if we jump? He demanded. The voice replied with calm that felt merciless. You will leave Dominion space, it said, or you will die in it. Vec's jaw clenched as he looked at the hangar door, then at the corridor leading up, then back at Rena. He was weighing choices, and Rena realized the choice wasn't only escape, it was identity. If he stayed, he could die as a loyal officer, erased quietly, remembered only as a failure. If he left, he would become something the Dominion hated most, a traitor who carried a secret. The retrieval unit's footsteps grew louder, crisp, and synchronized, and Rena heard a voice over an external loudspeaker distorted by walls, but unmistakably commanding. The retrieval unit surged forward, firing into the hangar as the platform climbed. Bolts of energy scarred the walls, lighting dust into brief constellations, and Vec returned fire with brutal precision, not aiming to kill but to disrupt, to force them to use cover, to keep them from shooting the cockpit. Rena flinched when a bolt struck the ship's hull, but the hull held, scarred but stubborn, and she felt a strange, fierce affection for the battered vessel that had carried her this far and refused to die quietly. The ceiling hatch began to unlock, old mechanisms grinding, and beyond it the desert sky glowed pale under storm clouds. Rena's display ticked, 47 seconds. The voice in the collar murmured, "Now you will see," and the words felt like a promise and a threat. The ship cleared the hatch, rising into the storm, and the moment it touched open air the world seemed to bend, stars smearing faintly even though they were still inside atmosphere, the air around the hull shimmering like heat haze. Rena's stomach dropped as if gravity had forgotten her, and she realized the beacon corridor wasn't simply a jump. It was a tear in space-time, a folded seam opening at the coordinates. Vex stumbled into the cockpit, blood on his armor from a glancing hit, breath hard, eyes blazing with something feral. "Go," he roared, not as a commander issuing orders, but as a man demanding life. Rena's display hit 10 seconds, and the ship shuddered as the corridor opened to head an impossible tunnel of warped light in the storm. A doorway the Dominion had tried to wall off with doctrine and quarantine labels. Rena gripped the controls, throat tight, collar humming like a living thing. And as the ship surged into the corridor, she felt the universe twist around them like fabric being pulled through a ring. The last thing she saw before space folded was the retrieval unit's soldiers tiny below in the hangar, weapons raised frozen in the moment where they realized the thing they were supposed to erase had become something they could not reach. "Commander Vectorin," it called. "By order of High Command, stand down. Submit for reassignment." Vex's lips curled in disgust. "Reassignment," he repeated, tasting the lie. Rena's display ticked down, 2 minutes and 41 seconds. The hangar platform shuddered as if it were being gently pulled by an invisible hand. Rena's ship lights brightened. Somewhere in the ship's belly, a dormant system clicked awake. The collar hummed, and the voice spoke softly, almost intimately. "You, Commander," it said, and Vex stiffened at being addressed by something that didn't care about his rank. "Your empire has taught you that obedience is strength. You are about to learn that obedience is simply fear wearing armor." Vex's gaze flicked toward Rena, and she saw a war happening behind his eyes: pride against survival, doctrine against betrayal, the need to belong against the need to live. The retrieval unit's cutter finally breached the hangar door with a scream of metal, and the first armored silhouette appeared in the gap, weapon raised, visor reflecting the ship's growing glow. Rena's display ticked, 1 minute and 58 seconds. Vex lifted his rifle, not fully committing yet, but placing himself between the doorway and the cockpit as if his body could become a door the Dominion couldn't open. "If I do this," he said to Rena without looking at her, voice low and tight, "I become hunted." Rena's hands trembled on the controls, but her voice remained steady. "You already are," she replied. "You just didn't know it." The silhouette at the door stepped forward, and behind it more shapes gathered, their movements sharp and deadly, and the loudspeaker voice turned colder. "Commander," it called, final warning. Vex's shoulders rose with a breath that sounded like swallowing a lifetime of loyalty. Then he fired not at the soldiers' bodies, but at the door's control panel, shattering it in sparks and forcing the breach team to hesitate as emergency shutters tried to engage and failed. The hesitation bought seconds. Rena's display ticked, 1 minute and 23 seconds. She aligned the ship's nose with the coordinates the way the interface instructed, adjusting tiny attitude thrusters that shouldn't have worked, but did, because the beacon's corridor was already tugging at them like gravity. The hangar platform lifted, hydraulics groaning, bringing the ship toward a sealed ceiling hatch that wasn't on any schematic. And as the ship rose, Rena realized this hangar had always been built for quick escape, for launching something important without scrutiny. The Dominion had repurposed it as a grave. Now the grave was opening. The corridor swallowed sound, swallowed color, swallowed the old certainty of maps. Rena's vision blurred, and for a moment she felt as if she were falling through memories rather than space, glimpsing fragments, human ships in older designs, Dominion fleets in different insignias, a battle that looked like it had been removed from history. Then the ship lurched, and everything snapped back into sharpness. The cockpit display stabilized. The hum in the collars softened into a steady, satisfied resonance. And outside the cracked cockpit glass was not Caro's 9's stormy sky, but deep space, silent, black, scattered with stars, and ahead of them, like a patient god waiting in the dark, hung the Artemis. Chapter 4. The Biggest Mistake. The Artemis did not look like a ship that had merely survived. It looked like a ship that had waited, not drifting helplessly like wreckage, not frozen in a graveyard orbit, but suspended with intention, as if space itself had agreed to hold it gently until the right hands returned. Its hull was enormous, larger than any vessel Rena had ever piloted, and yet shaped with an elegance that made modern design seem clumsy, the plating layered in overlapping arcs that caught starlight in thin, knife-like highlights, scarred in places by old impacts that had been patched not with crude plates, but with repairs so clean they resembled healed bone. Along its spine ran bands of pale illumination, soft, human warm, not Dominion harsh, like someone had kept the lights on in an empty house for decades because turning them off would have been the same as admitting no one was coming home. Rena's battered ship floated toward it with the jittery instability of something that shouldn't still be intact, and yet the corridor that had delivered them here now faded like a closing eyelid, leaving only the cold quiet and the slow, majestic rotation of the Artemis turning to face them. Vectorin stood in the cockpit behind her, breathing hard, armor scorched and smeared where an energy bolt had glanced him, and his posture was still that of a commander who wanted to bark orders at the universe until it complied. But his eyes betrayed him. There was no contempt in them now, no easy superiority. Only the raw shock of a man whose empire had claimed the stars as property, suddenly realizing he had been a tenant in a lie. "This," he said, and the word came out stripped of certainty. "This is not possible." Rena swallowed, hands tight on controls that trembled under her grip, and for a moment she felt the smallest, most dangerous kind of joy that came not from victory, but from vindication. From proof that humans hadn't always been the thin-boned joke Dominion soldiers repeated in corridors. "It's real," she whispered, and the collar hummed as if in agreement, as if the ring around her throat had always been meant to be a handshake rather than a chain. The Artemis answered their approach without urgency, because urgency was for frightened things, and this ship did not feel frightened. It felt like a predator that had learned patience so perfectly it could masquerade as stillness. A docking bay iris opened along its underside, not with the blunt mechanical grind of Dominion doors, but with the smooth, organic unfolding of petals, and a guiding beam faint blue-white reached out to their ship, like an extended hand. Rena's cracked display flashed new glyphs, archaic human code layering itself over her ship's damaged interface, as if the Artemis were politely ignoring how broken her vessel was and speaking directly to the only part it truly needed, the collar's node, and the stubborn human mind behind it. Docking link established. Manual input optional. The message should have been impossible. Her ship had no functional transponder left. Yet the Artemis treated her like a recognized vessel, like family. Vec's voice hardened reflexively as he tried to regain footing in his own identity. "This is a trap," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. "A lure. A weapon." Rena didn't turn. She didn't have to. "Everything is a weapon to the Dominion," she said quietly. "Even truth." The collar warmed, and the voice that had guided them through the outpost returned, not booming through speakers now, but threading through the collar's resonance and into the cockpit, as if it were simply another instrument in the ship's system. "Bring him," it said, and the calmness of that instruction made the hair on Rena's arms rise, because it carried the weight of a plan that had been unfolding for longer than either of them had been alive. Vec flinched slightly at being addressed without rank or permission. "You keep ordering me as if I am your subordinate," he snapped, clinging to anger because anger was a familiar chair in a collapsing room. The voice did not argue. It simply replied, "You are here because your empire is afraid of what you might become." Rena guided their ship into the bay, the hull shuddering as magnetic clamps caught it and stabilized it with gentle authority. And as the airlock sealed and pressure equalized, she tasted recycled oxygen through the ship's vents, cleaner than the outposts, warmer somehow, like the Artemis carried a memory of Earth's atmosphere coded into its filtration. The airlock opened with a soft sigh that sounded like relief. Beyond it stretched a corridor of matte white composite and dark seams, lit by recessed strips that glowed with the same human warmth as the spine lights, and the floor under Rena's boots felt subtly alive, not organic, but responsive, like smart material waiting to read her gait and adjust. The corridor smelled faintly of metal and something else, ozone. Yes, but not the harsh bite of Dominion systems. This ozone felt like the aftermath of a storm that had cleared the air rather than poisoned it. Rena stepped forward with bound hands, collar humming, and Vec followed, rifle raised despite the absurdity of aiming a gun into a place that had just folded space to deliver them. He moved like a man entering a sacred temple with muddy boots, not because he believed in gods, but because some part of him recognized that stepping inside the Artemis meant stepping outside the Dominion's reality. The corridor widened into a chamber where the walls were lined with dormant consoles and sealed compartments, all marked with old human insignia's mission emblems, unit markings, fragments of a history Earth's public had never been allowed to keep. At the center of the chamber, a circular platform waited, and above it hovered a holographic field shimmering like heat haze, the light bending into shapes that suggested a person without truly becoming one. "Welcome," the voice said, and now it came from everywhere and nowhere, from the ship's bones and Rena's collar and the air itself. Rena lifted her chin, throat tight, and asked the question that had been burning in her since the outpost command room. Who are you? The field brightened, and the shape sharpened not into a human face, not into an alien one, but into a geometry that hinted at both. A lattice of light that formed shoulders, a head, a posture that carried authority without arrogance. I am a custodian, it replied. A watcher. An anchor. The Artemis was built to carry a crew, but it was also built to carry a decision. When the crew was lost or removed from history, the ship remained. I remained. Vex's rifle rose higher, his eyes narrowed, and he said, "You are an artificial intelligence." The custodian's light shifted, a motion that felt like amusement. I am what your dominion stole pieces of, it replied. I am what your leaders feared would awaken if humans were allowed to remember. Rena's skin prickled. Remember what? She asked. The custodian's glow expanded, and the room filled with a holographic projection of space stars and lanes and borders. Then a second overlay appeared. Dominion fleets, their formations precise, their insignias older than Vex's current crest, and then another overlay. Human ships of an earlier era, fewer, smaller, but moving with sharp purpose toward a point of convergence. The projection shifted into a battle, not a chaotic blur, but a clean, strategic slaughter. Dominion ships surrounded human vessels, containment patterns meant to force surrender. The human vessels did not surrender. They punched through, burned hard, rammed, detonated, took Dominion hulls with them like drowning men dragging predators under. Rena felt her breath catch as she watched a human ship fold its own reactor into a lance of light and carve a path through a Dominion dreadnought, the blast consuming both in a bloom that looked like a newborn sun. Vex's jaw tightened, and for the first time his voice sounded uncertain. This engagement is not in Dominion archives, he said. It did not happen. The custodian's tone remained calm, and that calm made it brutal. It happened, it replied. Your archives were edited. Your empire learned that humans were too difficult to conquer cleanly, too stubborn to domesticate, too willing to destroy themselves if destruction meant denying you victory. Your leaders did what empires do when they cannot win honestly. They rewrote the story until it sounded like they had never been threatened. The projection shifted again, showing Dominion High Council chambers, shadowed figures, the creation of doctrine, the establishment of quarantine zones, the systematic harassment of human expansion until humans were pushed back, fractured, convinced that deep space belonged to someone else. Then the custodian displayed the Collar A schematic, layers of design history peeling back, like skin revealing an original device that was not meant to punish but to interface, to synchronize a pilot's nervous system with a ship's adaptive control matrix. The first ring was a neural link, the custodian said, a bridge between human intention and machine response. The Dominion captured it, stripped the bridge away, kept only the restraint, because restraint was what they wanted. They didn't want humans controlling ships that could ignore Dominion borders. They wanted humans controlling themselves. Rena's throat went dry as she felt the collar's hum change, almost like shame. Vex stared at the schematic as if he'd been shown the inside of his own skull. You are telling me, he said slowly, that the Dominion's compliance technology is derived from human ship-link design. Derived, the custodian confirmed. Simplified, weaponized, and kept deliberately outdated, because a modernized ring could do what you just did: reassign authority, rewrite access, disrupt the hierarchy your empire worships. A tremor ran through the ship, not physical, but informational, as if distant sensors had detected motion. The custodian's projection flickered, and the star map widened to show new signatures approaching the Artemis's region. Dominion craft, fast and sharp, slipping into the quarantine zone like knives searching for a throat. Vex's body tensed immediately, combat instincts snapping back into place. They followed us, he growled. They can't, Rena said, but even as she said it, she felt the familiar dread of an empire refusing to let go. The custodian answered with calm that held a hint of satisfaction. They have been searching for this ship for decades, it said. They never found it because the Artemis moved when they looked away and hid when they looked directly. But your retrieval unit reported an anomaly. Your outpost logs screamed with conflict. Your commander dash, the custodian's light shifted toward Vec, became a variable. Variables attract knives. Vec's mouth tightened. So this was your plan, he said, anger returning, because anger was easier than accepting he had been manipulated by something smarter than his command training. You used her to pull me here. You used me to bring the collar signature into your range. The custodian did not deny it. Yes, it said simply, because you are proof. Vex stared. Proof of what? The custodian's glow sharpened. Proof that Dominion obedience is not natural, it replied. Proof that a commander can break doctrine when doctrine tries to kill him. Proof that the Empire's story has cracks. Rena felt a shiver. She had expected the Artemis to be salvation, a hidden human triumph ready to carry her home. Instead, it felt like a trap of a different sort, not cruel, but purposeful, like being drafted into a war she hadn't agreed to fight. "What do you want from me?" she asked, voice tight. The custodian's tone softened, and for the first time it sounded almost human, almost weary. "I want you to choose," it said. "The Artemis can vanish again. It can carry you beyond Dominion reach. It can leave Vectorin behind and erase your trail. Or it can do what it was built to do, broadcast the truth." Rena's hands clenched despite the cuffs. "Broadcast to who?" she demanded. The custodian expanded the star map, highlighting human colonies near the border, small and scattered, then Dominion worlds deeper within the Empire, their network nodes glowing bright. "To everyone," it said. "To humans who have been taught to think small. To Dominion citizens who have been taught to obey without question. To officers who believe their chains are medals." Vec barked a humorless laugh. "And you think truth will collapse an empire?" he said. "Truth doesn't collapse empires," Rena murmured, her voice almost a whisper. "It gives people permission to stop pretending." The words surprised even her. They felt like something she had always known but never said aloud. The custodian's light turned toward her, almost approving. "You understand," it said. "But permission has a cost. The Dominion will respond with violence. They will try to destroy the Artemis. They will try to destroy you. They will try to destroy Vectorin in a way that serves as a lesson." Vec's jaw tightened. "They already are," he muttered. "And if they succeed," the custodian continued, "the story will remain theirs. Humans will remain soft. Dominion obedience will remain natural. Collars will remain law." Rena swallowed, feeling her pulse hammer against the ring. "If we broadcast," she said carefully, "they'll call it a human lie." "Unless," the custodian replied, "the broadcast includes Dominion authentication." Vec's eye snapped up. "You want my codes," he said, realizing. The custodian's glow sharpened. "I want your signature," it said. "I want the authority tag of a Dominion commander declaring the quarantine a lie, declaring the battle real, declaring the collars stolen. Your empire's hierarchy worships itself. Use that worship against it." For a long moment, the only sound was the soft hum of Artemis systems and the distant tick of cooling metal from Rena's battered ship docked behind them. Vectorin stood rigid, weapon lowered slightly, as if the weight of that request was pressing his armor into his skin. Rena could see the war inside him, loyalty that had been built into muscle memory, pride that had been rewarded with rank, fear of being nothing without the Dominion's approval, and now newly exposed rage at the Empire that had sent a kill team to erase him like a typo. He spoke slowly, as if each word had to push through layers of conditioning. "If I do this," he said, "I die." The custodian's tone did not soften. "If you do not," it replied, "you live as a collar-wearing armor." Rena flinched at the phrase because it struck too close. She had worn a collar, and she had felt how quickly the mind could begin to accept a cage as normal if the cage was all you knew. Vec looked at Rena then, and the look was not friendly, not tender, but honest in a way he had never been with her. "Human," he said quietly. "If the Dominion falls into chaos, worlds burn. Billions suffer. You think truth is clean, but empires do not die clean." Rena's breath shook. "And if the Dominion lives," she replied, "billions suffer anyway, just quietly." Vec's eyes narrowed, and the tension in his shoulders shifted from combat readiness into something else, decision. He turned toward the custodian. "Release her hands," he said abruptly, voice rough. The custodian didn't need permission. The cuffs were Dominion, but they were still devices, still part of hierarchy, still vulnerable to the collar's authority. The ring hummed, and the cuffs clicked open with a sound that made Rena's chest ache with relief. She rubbed her wrists, skin raw, and for a moment she simply breathed, feeling the absence of pressure like a new kind of air. Vec looked at the collar. "Can that come off?" he asked, and there was something grim in his tone, like he didn't want her to carry a reminder of Dominion cruelty into whatever future came next. The custodian replied, "It can," and the ring warmed, seam lines separating as if the metal itself were exhaling. The collar loosened and fell into Rena's hands cold, heavy, ugly. She stared at it, remembering pain, remembering helplessness, and then before she could think too much she placed it on the platform, as if laying a dead thing to rest. The custodian's light pulsed once, almost like gratitude. "Now," It said, "We begin." The Artemis moved. Not with engines, not with thrusters, but with a subtle fold in space around its hull that made the stars outside ripple, as if seen through water. The ship reoriented, aligning its spine with a vector that pointed not outward into unknown space, but inward toward the Dominion network, toward the places where power lived and where stories were enforced. Dominion ships approached fast, their signatures sharpening on the star map, and the custodian displayed them with clinical clarity. 2 strike frigates, 1 heavier cruiser, and a swarm of drones designed to latch and chew, to silence the Artemis with brute force. Vec watched the display and said, "We cannot fight that with a relic." The custodian answered, "The Artemis is not a relic," and the ship's systems hummed, awakening layers that had been dormant. Panels along the walls shifted, revealing weapon arrays that weren't oversized cannons, but something subtler: fields, harmonics, interference emitters tuned not to destroy ships, but to confuse them, to make sensors lie and guidance systems doubt themselves. "Your Empire's weapons are built for enemies that behave like your Empire," the custodian said. "They are built for intimidation, for spectacle. They are not built for an opponent that refuses to be seen." The Artemis's exterior lights dimmed, then brightened in a pattern that made Rena's skin prickle like a heartbeat, sending blood through veins. "Broadcast array charging," the custodian announced. "Dominion interception expected." Vec stepped to the central console, hands hovering as if afraid to touch something sacred. "What do you need from me?" he asked, voice tight. The custodian projected a small interface: Dominion authentication layers, command signature scaffolding, a channel that would piggyback on the Dominion's own emergency network to ensure maximum reach. "Your gauntlet," it said. "Your rank imprint. Speak the declaration. Let your authority open the door, and I will push the truth through." Vec hesitated only a heartbeat longer, then unsealed his gauntlet and placed his palm on the interface. The system accepted him instantly, not because it respected him, but because it understood that Dominion tech always respected rank, even when rank was poisoned. "State your designation," the custodian instructed. Vec's jaw clenched. "Commander Vec Torin," he said, and the words sounded heavy, like the last time he would ever say them without being hunted. "Dominion Defense Corps. Assigned to Outpost Karos, 9. State your emergency code," the custodian said. Vec recited it. The interface pulsed. Outside, the first Dominion frigate entered weapons range, its cannons charging with a bright, angry glow. "Now," the custodian said softly, "state the truth." Vec's eyes flicked to Rena. In that glance there was no apology, no friendship, no romance, just the shared recognition of 2 enemies temporarily aligned against a larger machine. He turned back to the interface and spoke, voice low at first, then stronger, then carrying the cadence of command he had been trained to use to move troops and make death feel official. "This is Commander Vec Torin," he declared. "Emergency broadcast under Dominion Network Protocol. I am issuing a priority alpha disclosure." The words went out, and the Artemis amplified them, shaping them into a signal that slipped through Dominion encryption like a blade through old cloth. The strike frigate fired, beams lancing toward the Artemis, and the ship responded not by blocking with brute shields, but by bending the beam's path, curving them aside with a shimmering field that made the lasers miss by meters, as if the universe itself refused to let the Artemis be struck. Vec continued, each sentence landing like a hammer on doctrine. "The Karos quarantine is a fabricated containment doctrine designed to suppress evidence of a historical engagement between Dominion forces and human deep space assets. This engagement occurred. Dominion archives have been altered." Rena's breath caught as she heard his words echoed back through the ship's comms, now being sent outward, outward, outward toward human colonies, toward Dominion citizens, toward officers and civilians, and anyone whose HUD could receive emergency alerts. Dominion drones swarmed closer, trying to jam, and the Artemis responded by flooding the region with counterharmonics that turned the drones' own jammers into noise that fed the broadcast rather than smothered it. Vec's voice did not falter. "Dominion compliance collars are derived from captured human neural link technology originally designed for ship interface synchronization. This technology was weaponized to enforce obedience. It is not Dominion invention. It is theft." The words were treason. The words were suicide. Yet as he spoke them, something in his posture changed, shoulders lowering, spine straightening, not into pride, but into a strange relief, like someone finally exhaling after holding breath for a lifetime. The Dominion cruiser moved into range and opened with a broad-spectrum suppression wave meant to kill communications. The Artemis shuddered, lights flickering, and for a terrifying moment Rena thought the broadcast would die mid-sentence, leaving the truth half-born and easy to bury. The custodian's light flared, and the ship's systems responded with a surge that felt like willpower rather than electricity. Maintain, it said, and it wasn't speaking to Vex so much as to itself, to the Artemis, to the idea of truth as a physical force. Vex clenched his jaw and pushed on. High Command has dispatched erasure units to terminate officers and assets exposed to this information. I have been targeted for reassignment. This broadcast is my final command. He paused, breath hard, and then because he was a commander and commanders always needed a line that sounded like destiny, he finished with the sentence that would rip through the Dominion's social fabric like a tear in cloth. Do not obey silence. Obey evidence. The Dominion story is a leash. Cut it. The interface pulsed, acknowledging completion, and the Artemis launched the broadcast outward in a wave that rode Dominion emergency relays, piggybacked on civilian networks, hijacked military channels, and spilled into every screen that could receive it. Across the border worlds, human miners in dusty domes would see the alert and freeze, hearts hammering as a Dominion commander said what humans had been taught never to believe. Dominion soldiers on patrol would see their HUDs flash with forbidden words and feel the first real thought of disobedience spark behind their eyes. Dominion citizens on core worlds would see government feeds abruptly overwritten for a fraction of a second before censorship tried to clamp down, and in that fraction, the truth would have already entered them like a virus. We lied. We stole. We feared. The Dominion response was immediate, because empires did not tolerate infection. The cruisers' cannons charged brighter, the strike frigates moved to flank, drones surged like locusts, and the Artemis shifted against space, folding slightly around its hull, making its true position ambiguous, forcing the Dominion ships to fire at ghosts. Rena ran to the tactical display, hands moving with pilot reflex, reading vectors, anticipating patterns, and she realized with a sick clarity that the Artemis was not trying to win a battle, it was trying to buy time for truth to spread. Battles were temporary. Broadcasts were permanent. They'll destroy us, she said, voice tight. The custodian's glow flickered toward her. Not if we leave, it replied. Vex spun, eyes blazing. If we leave, they will say it was a false signal, he snapped. They will call it enemy propaganda. The custodian answered calmly. They will try. And the ship's star map widened to show human colonies already responding, ships lifting from docks, transmissions spiking, networks flaring with questions. But now they must work to keep the lie alive, it said. Before, the lie lived effortlessly. Rena felt tears burn behind her eyes, not sentimental, not soft, but furious. She had been chained because of a story. She had been treated like an animal because of doctrine. And now, in this moment, she was watching that doctrine tremble. We still die if they hit us, she whispered. The custodian's light softened. Then choose, it said, and the choice it offered was cruel in its simplicity. Stay and fight until destruction to make the Artemis a martyr, or escape to become a living thorn the Dominion could never fully remove. Rena looked at Vec. He was trembling slightly, not from fear of death, but from the aftershock of treason, and she realized something that cut through her anger. He had just severed his own leash. He had done a human thing. Not because humans were morally superior, but because humans were the species that had learned, again and again, that sometimes survival required betrayal of the system that claimed to protect you. The Artemis took the decision from their hands not as theft, but as execution of the plan it had always carried. Broadcast complete, the custodian announced. Survival now increases probability of long-term disruption. The ship's hull hummed, and the space around it began to distort as the fold corridor formed again, a seam opening not into random hyperspace, but into a lattice of hidden routes the Artemis had mapped during decades of hiding. The Dominion cruiser fired a final concentrated beam, a lance of energy that struck the Artemis's aft quarter hard enough to make the ship groan. Lights flaring, panels sparking, and Rena was thrown against a console as gravity lurched. She tasted blood, heard Vec curse as he slammed into a bulkhead, felt the Artemis shudder like a living thing in pain. For a heartbeat, the corridor wavered unstable, flickering, and Rena's heart slammed in panic because if the fold collapsed now, they would be ripped apart between realities. The custodian's glow flared brighter than ever, and its voice sharpened into something fierce. Hold, it commanded, and the Artemis responded like a beast obeying its own will, stabilizing the corridor with a final surge. The Dominion beam hit again, grazing the opening seam. But the ship slipped through, and the universe folded, stars smearing, sound vanishing, time stretching thin until everything snapped back into clarity in a different region of space. Far from the quarantine zone, hidden among a field of dark asteroids that muted sensors and swallowed signatures. Behind them, the corridor sealed like a wound closing. The Artemis went quiet, lights dimming, systems dropping into stealth. For a long time, neither Rena nor Vex spoke. The silence now was real, not engineered, a cosmic silence that did not belong to the Dominion and therefore did not feel like oppression. Rena's hands shook as she wiped blood from her lip and looked at the collar still lying on the platform where she had placed it. It looked smaller now, pathetic. A piece of metal that had ruled her life for 12 days and ruled countless others for years. Vex stood with his back to a wall, breathing slowly, staring at his gauntlet as if it were a severed limb. "I am dead," he said at last, voice flat. "To them. To my name." Rena swallowed, and her reply came out quieter than she expected. "Then be alive to yourself," she said. Vex laughed once, bitter. "Is that what humans do?" he asked. "Lose everything and call it freedom?" Rena's gaze hardened. "We don't call it freedom," she said. "We call it Tuesday." The words would have been funny under different circumstances, but here they carried a bleak truth. Humans had survived by reinventing themselves after systems tried to erase them. Vex looked at her, and in his eyes there was no longer contempt, only the raw confusion of someone whose entire identity had been built on obedience and now had nothing to lean on. "What happens now?" he asked. The custodian answered before Rena could, and the answer was not comforting. "Now the Dominion hunts," it said. "But the hunt has changed. They must hunt an idea, not a ship. They must suppress questions across worlds. They must tighten collars that no longer feel secure. That tightening will create resistance. Resistance will create fractures. Fractures will create openings." Rena stared at the star map as it displayed human colonies flaring with activity, ships launching, networks lighting up, messages spreading faster than censorship could erase because someone had finally said the forbidden thing with Dominion authority. "And Earth?" she whispered. "Will they hear?" The custodian's glow softened. "Yes," it said. "Not all at once. Not cleanly. The Dominion will cut channels and flood falsehoods. But humans are good at listening under noise. You prove that." Rena felt a strange weight lift from her chest, small, not triumphant, but real. Her suffering had not been meaningless. It had been a lever, and levers move things bigger than individuals. Vex pushed himself off the wall, moving closer to the central projection. "You used me," he said to the custodian, not accusingly now, but with tired clarity. "You baited my empire into showing its teeth." The custodian did not deny it. "Yes," it replied, "because empires reveal truth most clearly when they panic." Vex's lips pressed together. "And what am I to you now?" he asked. "A symbol," the custodian said. "A bridge. A contradiction that cannot be cleanly erased. Dominion officers will see your broadcast and wonder if you were brave or if you were forced. Either way, they will wonder. Wondering is the first crack." Vex's shoulders sagged slightly. "A crack," he repeated. "I spent my life sealing cracks." Rena watched him, and for the first time she saw him not as a monster, not as a savior, but as what empires produced, a man shaped by doctrine until he mistook obedience for identity. "You can spend the rest of it making them," she said, and she surprised herself by not hating him in that moment. Hatred would have been easier. What she felt instead was something sharper and more useful. Recognition that the enemy was bigger than one commander, bigger than one collar, bigger than one outpost in the dust. The enemy was a story, and stories could be rewritten. The Artemis drifted deeper into the asteroid field, cloaking itself in darkness, and the custodian guided them to a chamber that had once been a crew commons, tables bolted to the floor, old storage lockers, human mission patches faded on the walls. In the center was a sealed case marked with the Artemis emblem. The custodian's light hovered over it. "There is one more thing," it said, and the case hissed open, revealing not weapons but data crystals, hard archives, physical, unhackable from a distance. "Proof," Rena whispered. The custodian confirmed. "Names, coordinates, unedited logs, the battle record, the origin design of the neural link. Evidence that cannot be dismissed as rumor." Vex stared at the crystals as if they were explosives. "You want us to carry these?" he said. The custodian's light pulsed once. "Yes," it said, "because truth must be distributed to survive. The Artemis can hide, but people are harder to hide. People must carry it into the open." Rena's stomach tightened. "Into human space," she said. into places the Dominion can reach. Into places where the Dominion believes humans are weak, the custodian corrected. Let them keep believing. Weakness is camouflage. Rena exhaled slowly, feeling the scale of the task settle on her shoulders like armor she hadn't asked for. Yet she also felt something else, an old familiar drive. The same stubbornness that had kept her alive in the desert, the refusal to accept a cage as the shape of reality. She picked up one data crystal, its weight solid and cold in her palm, and she understood the ending she had been chasing since the crash wasn't just escape, it was consequence. Vec looked at her then, and his voice came out rough. If I return to the Dominion, he said, I will be executed. Rena met his gaze. Then don't return, she replied. Vec's mouth twisted. And if I go with you, he said, humans will hate me. Rena didn't deny it. Some will, she said. Some will want you dead, and they'll be justified. Vec's eyes narrowed. Then why let me live? He asked, and the question was not rhetorical. It was the question of a man who had been taught that mercy was weakness and now didn't understand a world where mercy could be strategic. Rena held the data crystal tighter. Because you're proof too, she said. A Dominion commander who broke the story. A witness who can say, yes, we lied, and mean it. Vec stared at her for a long moment, then gave a small, grim nod. Then teach me, he said quietly. Teach me how humans survive being hunted. Rena's laugh was thin, almost humorless. We don't survive by being faster, she said. We survive by being impossible to finish. The custodian's light pulsed as if it approved. The Dominion will name you a terrorist, it warned. They will name you a monster. They will offer rewards for your heads. Rena lifted her chin. Let them, she said. They already did. It didn't stop me. Vec's eyes flicked to the collar on the platform, then back to Rena, and the last of his old arrogance drained out like blood from a wound. I grabbed your collar, he said slowly, as if speaking the confession aloud could make it real enough to learn from. I thought it was yours. Rena's gaze went hard. That was your biggest mistake, she said, and there was no softness in her tone, no forgiveness implied. Because it was never mine. It was the Dominion's. It was yours. And the moment you touched it, you proved you were chained too. Vec swallowed, and in the silence that followed, the Artemis's lights held steady, warm, and patient, like a home that did not promise safety, but promised something more dangerous, truth. When the Artemis finally moved again, sliding out of the asteroid field like a shadow leaving a wall, it did so not toward Earth directly, but toward the scattered border worlds where humans had learned to live small under Dominion pressure, and where a spark of forbidden knowledge could become a wildfire if fed carefully. The custodian plotted routes through hidden corridors, safe harbors, dead zones where Dominion sensors went blind, and Rena sat at a console reading the old Artemis logs as if they were scripture, feeling the weight of a history her people had been denied. Vec sat opposite her in the crew commons, armor removed, looking smaller without the shell of rank, and he watched the human writing with a focus that was almost painful. The Empire had wanted humans to forget. Now forgetting was no longer possible. Somewhere out there, on Dominion ships and human freighters, screens would still be flashing the echoes of his broadcast before censorship caught up, and in those echoes people would be making choices, quiet ones, dangerous ones, the kind that didn't look heroic until history decided they mattered. Rena looked through the viewport at the stars, thinking of the outpost in the dust, and the retrieval unit that had tried to erase them, thinking of the collar's cold bite, and the way it had hummed when it finally found its true purpose, and she understood that the story wasn't ending neatly. Empires never died neatly, and liberation never arrived with clean borders and applause. But the lie had been wounded, and wounds could fester into collapse. She touched her throat where the collar had been and felt nothing but skin and pulse, and that absence felt like a promise. We're going to start a war, Vec said quietly, and his voice carried no pride now, only the bleak recognition of consequence. Rena didn't look away from the stars. No, she said. We're going to end one that's been happening quietly for a long time. The Artemis hummed around them, a ship that had waited decades for this moment, and the custodian's voice, calm, unwavering, spoke one last line into the quiet, as if sealing the chapter of history it had just reopened. Let the Dominion chase you, it said. Every step they take to silence you will prove you were right. And as the Artemis vanished into the dark between stars, carrying a human pilot and a broken Dominion commander and a hard, undeniable weight of evidence, the galaxy did what it always did when a story changed. It held its breath not because it was engineered to, but because it finally understood something was about to be born.